Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old botanist and mother of one, thought her biggest worry was helping her 12-year-old daughter Emma adjust to their new neighborhood. Then Martha Thompson knocked on their door at 7:30 on a Saturday morning demanding the immediate removal of their sunflower garden. What happened next will make you question everything you know about your own HOA board members. Before you hear this story, ask yourself, do you really know what your HOA president does behind closed doors? This happened just 18 months ago in Riverside Estates, a quiet suburban community outside Sacramento. The family involved, they're still living there, and their sunflowers bloom bigger every summer. Sarah had spent 3 years saving for their dream home in Riverside Estates. As a research botanist at UC Davis, she'd always imagined having space for a proper garden where she could teach Emma about plant biology hands-on. The modest 3-bedroom house came with a quarter-acre backyard that faced east, perfect for sun-loving plants. The HOA paperwork seemed straightforward enough during escrow. Standard restrictions on paint colors, fence heights, and major landscaping changes. Nothing about flowers. That first spring in their new home, Sarah carefully planned an educational garden for Emma. She researched native California plants that would thrive in their zone and provide learning opportunities. Sunflowers topped the list. These giants would demonstrate phototropism, the fascinating way plants follow the sun across the sky. Emma, who'd been struggling with the move and missing her old friends, lit up when Sarah described how the flowers would tower over both of them by summer's end. Sarah purchased heirloom mammoth sunflower seeds and spent weeks preparing the soil with Emma's eager help. They tested pH levels, added compost, and marked out a neat row along the back fence where the flowers wouldn't shade other plants. Emma insisted on naming each potential flower, creating little markers with names like Sunny and Goldie. For the first time since the move, Sarah heard her daughter humming while working in the dirt. The sunflower seedlings emerged in late April, their first leaves unfurling like green hearts reaching toward the morning light. Sarah documented their growth with photographs, planning to create a time-lapse project for Emma's science class. The neighbors seemed charmed by the educational garden. Mrs. Garcia from next door often stopped to chat about Sarah's expertise, asking advice about her own struggling tomatoes. Even the mailman commented on how the bright green shoots added life to the neighborhood's beige conformity. Martha Thompson had been HOA president of Riverside Estates for 6 years, a position she'd claimed after retiring from 35 years as a high school principal. At 64, Martha missed the daily authority of managing teenagers and found perfect satisfaction in managing homeowners instead. She conducted her weekly neighborhood inspections every Saturday morning, armed with a clipboard, measuring tape and the complete HOA bylaws memorized down to every subsection. Martha lived alone in the largest house in the development, a corner lot with extensive landscaping that she maintained obsessively. Her front yard displayed the perfect HOA aesthetic: drought-resistant shrubs and regulation mulch precisely trimmed hedges, and not a single blade of grass exceeding the 2.5-inch maximum height. Behind her house, a large greenhouse dominated the backyard, its panels tinted dark enough to obscure the interior. Martha had installed the structure 3 years earlier, claiming it was for orchid cultivation, though no neighbor had ever seen her prized flowers. The greenhouse operation required Martha's constant attention. Every morning at dawn she checked temperature controls, adjusted hydroponic nutrient levels, and tended to 36 mature cannabis plants thriving under full-spectrum LED lights. This wasn't casual home growing. Martha had invested $40,000 in professional equipment, carbon filters to eliminate odors, automated irrigation systems, and climate controls that maintained perfect growing conditions year-round. Her plants produced premium quality flower that she processed, packaged, and distributed through an elaborate network of buyers who believed they were purchasing from a young entrepreneur named Mao Zedong. Martha's cannabis operation generated over $8,000 monthly in untaxed income, money she desperately needed to maintain her expensive lifestyle. Her teacher's pension barely covered the mortgage on her oversized house, let alone the luxury SUV, designer clothes, and frequent spa treatments that maintained her image of authority and success. The illegal income allowed Martha to present herself as the successful retiree she pretended to be, while the greenhouse provided the perfect cover for her criminal enterprise. When Martha spotted Sarah's sunflower seedlings during her Saturday inspection, she felt the familiar rush of power that came with catching violations. These weren't approved landscaping. The HOA bylaws clearly stated that any new plantings required architectural review, committee approval, and Martha was certain no application had crossed her desk. Here was an opportunity to establish dominance over the new resident, a botanist, who might think her education exempted her from community standards. Martha knocked on Sarah's door that Saturday morning, with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. She introduced herself as HOA President and immediately demanded the removal of the unauthorized plantings. When Sarah politely explained that the sunflowers were temporary educational plants for her daughter, Martha's voice sharpened. Rules were rules. The Architectural Review Committee hadn't approved any new landscaping, and failure to comply would result in daily fines until the violation was corrected. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd read the HOA documents carefully and remembered nothing about approval requirements for simple flowers. Martha handed her a formal violation notice, already filled out with Sarah's address and a detailed description of the infraction. Daily fines of $50 would begin in 72 hours if the plants weren't removed. Martha's thin smile never reached her eyes as she explained that educational purposes didn't excuse policy violations. After Martha left, Sarah immediately pulled out her HOA documents and searched every page for landscaping restrictions. The bylaws mentioned approval requirements for major changes like trees, permanent structures, and landscape modifications requiring irrigation. Flowers weren't mentioned anywhere. Even more confusing, the Architectural Review Committee application process required detailed plans and a $100 fee for proposed changes. This seemed excessive for temporary educational plants that would be removed after harvest. David Chen, Sarah's husband and a software engineer who worked from home, had watched the entire encounter from their kitchen window. His analytical mind immediately flagged the inconsistencies in Martha's demands. If the HOA was so strict about landscaping approvals, why hadn't they required permission before Sarah planted? The violation notice seemed pre-prepared, as if Martha had been waiting for an excuse to establish control over their family. Emma was heartbroken when she learned about Martha's demands. The 12-year-old had been documenting the sunflowers' growth in a journal, measuring their height daily and researching sunflower varieties for a school project. She couldn't understand why someone would want to destroy her educational garden when it wasn't hurting anyone. Sarah felt torn between teaching her daughter to respect authority and protecting the learning project they'd worked on together. That weekend, Sarah decided to research Martha Thompson more thoroughly. As a scientist, she approached problems systematically, gathering data before drawing conclusions. She started with public records, discovering that Martha's house was assessed at nearly twice the value of their own home. For someone living on a teacher's pension, Martha seemed to maintain an expensive lifestyle that didn't match her claimed income sources. Sarah also began paying closer attention to Martha's property during her evening walks with Emma. The greenhouse dominated Martha's backyard, its dark-tinted panels making it impossible to see inside. Unlike most hobby greenhouse operations, this structure had professional-grade ventilation systems and electrical connections that seemed excessive for orchid cultivation. Most suspicious was the complete absence of visible orchids anywhere on Martha's property, despite her claimed expertise in exotic flower growing. The violation notice deadline approached with no resolution. Sarah had submitted a formal appeal to the HOA board, including photographs of her educational garden and citations from the community bylaws showing no approval requirement for temporary flowers. Martha responded with a curt letter stating that all appeals had been denied and daily fines would commence immediately. The first $50 fine appeared in their mailbox 3 days later. Martha's harassment escalated beyond the sunflower issue. She began finding additional violations on Sarah's property: a garden hose left visible from the street, outdoor furniture placed too close to the property line, and window boxes that allegedly exceeded approved planter dimensions. Each violation came with its own daily fine structure, creating mounting financial pressure designed to force compliance through economic warfare. Frank Martinez, a 72-year-old retired Marine who lived across the street from Martha, had been watching the harassment with growing concern. Frank's military training had taught him to observe patterns, and Martha's behavior toward the Chen family matched classic intimidation tactics. More troubling were the observations he'd made about Martha's greenhouse operation during his early morning runs. Frank had noticed the strange schedule Martha maintained around her greenhouse. She visited the structure before dawn and after sunset, but never during daylight hours when neighbors might observe her activities. The professional ventilation system ran constantly, even during moderate weather when orchids wouldn't require such intensive climate control. Most suspicious was the sweet, distinctive odor that occasionally drifted from the greenhouse during equipment maintenance, and smell Frank recognized from his younger years in California. The financial pressure from mounting fines began affecting the Chen family's stability. Sarah calculated that Martha's violations would cost them over $400 monthly if the harassment continued. David suggested they might need to consider selling the house and moving somewhere with less aggressive HOA management. Emma overheard these conversations and began having nightmares about losing her home and her sunflower garden. Sarah's background as a research botanist finally proved valuable when she decided to fight back systematically. She began documenting every interaction with Martha, photographing her property daily to disprove false violations, and researching HOA law through UC Davis's legal database. California's Davis-Sterling Act governed HOA operations, and Sarah discovered that Martha's fine structure violated several state requirements for due process and reasonable enforcement. More importantly, Sarah learned that HOA board members could be held personally liable for harassment and selective enforcement of community rules. If she could prove that Martha was applying rules inconsistently or using her position for personal retaliation, the HOA president could face legal consequences and financial damages. This knowledge gave Sarah hope that they could fight Martha's bullying through legitimate channels. The breakthrough came when Frank Martinez approached Sarah during one of her evening walks. The retired veteran had been wrestling with his conscience about Martha's suspicious activities, but seeing a family being harassed pushed him past his reluctance to get involved. Frank invited Sarah and David to coffee at his house, where he shared his observations about Martha's greenhouse operation and his suspicions about illegal activities. Frank's military experience had taught him surveillance techniques, and he'd been casually monitoring Martha's property for months. He'd documented the unusual traffic patterns around Martha's house, photographing license plates of visitors who came and went at odd hours. Most significantly, Frank had confirmed that Martha's greenhouse operation bore no resemblance to orchid cultivation, despite her claims to the HOA board and neighbors. Armed with Frank's observations and her own research, Sarah began connecting disturbing patterns in Martha's behavior. The HOA president's expensive lifestyle didn't match her claimed income. Her greenhouse operation required professional-grade equipment inconsistent with hobby growing, and her harassment of the Chen family seemed designed to establish dominance and discourage scrutiny of her activities. Sarah realized that Martha's attack on their sunflower garden wasn't really about HOA rules at all. The botanist's presence in the neighborhood represented a potential threat to Martha's illegal operation. Someone with professional plant knowledge might eventually notice inconsistencies in Martha's orchid cultivation claims or recognize the telltale signs of cannabis growing. By harassing Sarah into submission or forcing the family to move, Martha was protecting her criminal enterprise. The evidence-gathering phase required careful coordination between Sarah, David, and Frank. Sarah used her scientific training to document everything systematically: photographs with timestamps, copies of all HOA communications, financial records of mounting fines, and detailed observations of Martha's property. David contributed his technical skills, helping create encrypted digital files and secure communication methods. Frank provided surveillance expertise and served as an additional witness to Martha's suspicious activities. 3 months into the harassment campaign, Sarah had compiled enough evidence to approach authorities. The HOA violations clearly showed selective enforcement and harassment patterns that violated California's fair housing laws. More significantly, Frank's surveillance had documented activities around Martha's greenhouse that warranted investigation by law enforcement. Sarah contacted the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office and requested a meeting with officers familiar with agricultural crimes. Detective Maria Santos had investigated numerous illegal cannabis operations throughout Sacramento County and immediately recognized the patterns Sarah described. Professional-grade greenhouse equipment, expensive lifestyle inconsistent with claimed income, and paranoid behavior toward neighbors all matched profiles of sophisticated growing operations. More compelling was Martha's harassment campaign against a botanist, which suggested fear of professional scrutiny. Detective Santos explained that investigating HOA harassment required different approaches than drug crimes. But the combination of both issues created opportunities for comprehensive law enforcement response. If Martha was indeed operating illegal cannabis cultivation, the drug charges would be handled by narcotics specialists. The HOA harassment and selective enforcement issues fell under civil rights violations and could result in separate criminal charges. The investigation required patience and careful coordination. Detective Santos arranged for surveillance of Martha's property, while Sarah continued documenting HOA harassment. Frank's military background made him an ideal civilian observer, providing additional eyes on Martha's activities without compromising the official investigation. The plan required everyone to maintain normal routines while building the comprehensive case that would end Martha's dual criminal enterprises. Martha's paranoia increased as summer progressed and her sunflower harassment failed to break the Chen family's resistance. She began conducting more frequent property inspections, searching desperately for additional violations that might force Sarah into submission. Martha's violation notices became increasingly petty, measuring grass height with rulers, citing microscopic paint chips on fence posts, and claiming that children's sidewalk chalk drawings violated community aesthetic standards. The escalation worried David, who feared that Martha's desperation might lead to more dangerous harassment tactics. Sarah shared his concerns, but recognized that backing down would only encourage Martha's criminal behavior and leave other families vulnerable to similar abuse. Emma, now 13 and more aware of the adult conflict surrounding her, begged her parents not to give up on their home or her beloved sunflower garden. By late July, Sarah's sunflowers had grown to impressive heights, some reaching over 8 feet tall with massive flower heads that tracked the sun's movement across the sky. Emma's school project had evolved into a comprehensive study of plant biology that impressed her science teacher and classmates. The educational garden had achieved everything Sarah had hoped for, while also serving as a powerful symbol of the family's refusal to be intimidated by Martha's harassment. The breakthrough came on a sweltering August afternoon when Martha's greenhouse cooling system malfunctioned during a heat wave. The equipment failure created an emergency that required immediate attention to prevent losing her entire crop. For the first time in months, Martha was forced to work in her greenhouse during daylight hours with the ventilation system running at maximum capacity to prevent heat damage to her cannabis plants. Frank Martinez was working in his front yard when the distinctive sweet odor of flowering cannabis began drifting across the neighborhood. His military experience had familiarized him with the smell during deployments in regions where the plant grew wild, and there was no mistaking the powerful aroma now filling the air around Martha's property. Frank immediately contacted Sarah and Detective Santos, providing real-time updates on the situation. Detective Santos recognized the equipment failure as the perfect opportunity to obtain probable cause for searching Martha's property. The overwhelming cannabis odor provided legal justification for investigating suspected drug cultivation. While the heat emergency made it likely that any evidence would be clearly visible, she coordinated with narcotics specialists and arranged for immediate response to Martha's address. The police response began as a routine welfare check, with officers expressing concern about reports of strange odors and equipment malfunctions that might indicate dangerous conditions. Martha answered her door in a state of barely controlled panic, her clothes stained with plant matter and her hands shaking from the stress of her equipment crisis. She attempted to deny officers entry, claiming that everything was fine and no assistance was needed. Officer Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in drug investigations, immediately recognized Martha's behavior and the powerful cannabis odor emanating from her backyard. The combination of the suspicious smell, her nervous demeanor, and reports of equipment problems provided clear probable cause for a protective sweep of the property to ensure no dangerous conditions existed. The discovery inside Martha's greenhouse exceeded even Detective Santos's expectations. 36 mature cannabis plants thrived under professional growing lights, their heavy flower heads indicating plants near harvest. The sophisticated hydroponic system, climate controls, and security measures represented an investment of tens of thousands of dollars in illegal drug production equipment. Most damning was the detailed cultivation log Martha had maintained, documenting growing schedules, harvest yields, and distribution records. Martha's arrest that afternoon created immediate shockwaves throughout Riverside Estates. Neighbors who had respected her authority as HOA president struggled to reconcile the successful community leader image with the reality of the illegal drug operation discovered in her backyard. The professional scope of the cannabis cultivation suggested this wasn't casual personal use but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated under their noses for years. The HOA harassment charges followed Martha's drug arrest by several days, as prosecutors reviewed Sarah's comprehensive documentation of selective enforcement and retaliation. The evidence clearly showed that Martha had used her position of authority to intimidate a family whose professional expertise posed a potential threat to her illegal activities. The harassment campaign violated multiple state laws governing HOA operations and fair housing protections. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness as Martha's dual criminal enterprises finally came to light. The vindication was satisfying after months of harassment and financial pressure, but the destruction of community trust saddened her scientific mind that valued truth and transparency. Emma, now 13 and more sophisticated in her understanding of adult conflicts, asked thoughtful questions about why someone in authority would break the laws they claimed to enforce. The legal consequences for Martha extended far beyond criminal charges for drug cultivation and HOA harassment. The IRS investigation into her unreported income from cannabis sales resulted in substantial tax evasion charges and penalties. Civil lawsuits from other homeowners who had suffered Martha's harassment created additional financial liability that would continue for years beyond her criminal sentence. Most importantly for Sarah's family, the revelation of Martha's hypocrisy invalidated all the bogus HOA violations and fines that had been accumulating for months. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency meeting following Martha's arrest, immediately dismissed all pending violations and refunded the fines the Chen family had been forced to pay. Sarah's sunflower garden was officially recognized as an approved educational project that enhanced the community. The transformation of Riverside Estates following Martha's departure created opportunities for positive change throughout the neighborhood. Frank Martinez was elected to the HOA board, bringing military discipline and genuine concern for community welfare to the position Martha had corrupted. The new board implemented transparent processes for violation reporting and appeals, ensuring that no homeowner would face Martha's style of harassment again. Sarah's expertise as a botanist became a community resource rather than a perceived threat. She established neighborhood gardening workshops that taught sustainable landscaping techniques and helped homeowners create educational gardens similar to her successful sunflower project. Emma, now confident and articulate about her plant biology knowledge, assisted with the children's programs that made gardening fun and educational for neighborhood families. The greenhouse that had housed Martha's illegal operation was converted into a community center where residents could grow vegetables and flowers in a cooperative environment. The expensive equipment Martha had installed for cannabis cultivation found new purpose supporting legitimate gardening projects that brought neighbors together rather than hiding criminal activities behind tinted glass and locked doors. Detective Santos used Martha's case as a training example for other officers investigating suspected drug operations, demonstrating how criminal enterprises often involve secondary crimes like harassment and intimidation to protect illegal activities. Sarah's systematic documentation and Frank's military-trained surveillance had created the perfect case study for community policing approaches that relied on citizen cooperation and professional investigation techniques. The legal resolution took 18 months to complete, during which Martha faced multiple criminal trials and civil lawsuits that gradually dismantled the expensive lifestyle her illegal activities had supported. She eventually pleaded guilty to drug cultivation, tax evasion and civil rights violations in exchange for a reduced sentence that included restitution payments to affected homeowners and community service requirements. Sarah's sunflower garden became a neighborhood landmark that represented the triumph of educational values over authoritarian harassment. Each summer, Emma and her friends planted new varieties of giant sunflowers that grew taller and more impressive than the previous year's crop. The flowers served as living symbols of what communities could accomplish when residents supported each other's legitimate interests instead of enabling criminal abuse of authority. The story of Martha Thompson's downfall spread throughout the region's HOA communities, creating awareness about the importance of transparency and accountability in neighborhood governance. Sarah was invited to speak at property management conferences about recognizing signs of corruption and harassment, helping other communities identify potential problems before they escalated to criminal levels. 3 years after Martha's arrest, Sarah Chen still lives in Riverside Estates with her family, but their home is now part of a thriving community where educational gardens flourish and neighbors support each other's legitimate interests. Emma, now 16 and planning to study botany in college like her mother, tends an expanded garden that includes not only sunflowers but also vegetables and herbs that she shares with elderly neighbors who appreciate her knowledge and enthusiasm. The greenhouse that once housed Martha's criminal operation now serves as headquarters for the Riverside Estates Community Garden Project, where residents of all ages learn sustainable growing techniques and children discover the fascination of plant biology through hands-on experience. Frank Martinez, now 75 and still serving on the HOA board, often remarks that the community is stronger and more united than it ever was under Martha's authoritarian rule. Sarah's scientific approach to fighting HOA harassment has inspired other homeowners facing similar challenges to document violations systematically and seek appropriate legal remedies rather than simply enduring abuse. Her story demonstrates that standing up to corrupted authority requires patience, evidence, and community support, but the results can transform entire neighborhoods for the better. Martha Thompson, now 71, and completing her sentence for drug cultivation and civil rights violations, lives in a modest apartment outside Sacramento where her neighbors are unaware of her criminal past. Her expensive house in Riverside Estates was sold to pay restitution and legal fees, while her beloved greenhouse was repurposed to serve the community she had spent years intimidating and controlling. The sunflowers that started this entire conflict continue blooming each summer in Sarah's garden, now joined by dozens of similar educational projects throughout Riverside Estates. These magnificent plants serve as living reminders that communities thrive when residents are free to pursue legitimate interests, without fear of harassment from corrupted authorities who hide criminal activities behind the facade of rule enforcement. Emma Chen's original school project about sunflower biology has evolved into a comprehensive study of how plants and communities both require healthy environments to flourish. Her research, now spanning 6 growing seasons, demonstrates that diversity, transparency, and mutual support create conditions where both gardens and neighborhoods can reach their full potential without the shadow of hidden corruption stunting their growth. This story will change how you look at every HOA letter in your mailbox, every neighborhood authority figure who seems too controlling, and every community leader whose lifestyle doesn't match their claimed income sources. Sometimes the people who shout loudest about following rules are the ones with the most to hide, and sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the soil where corruption once tried to take root.